Oggetti socievoli.
Oggetti Socievoli presenta.
A Conversation With is hosted by Prisca Arosio.
So I'm Paulina Jurman, and I am a designer, researcher, and lecturer at the Industrial Design Department of Central St. Martin's here in London. My background is in industrial design. I came to London many years ago to do a master's at the RCA in a course called Industrial Design Engineering. I'm South American, and where I grew up, I studied mechanical engineering, which felt that was as close as possible to industrial design. We had graphic design and architecture, and somewhere in between those was mechanical engineering. So I studied that, and then I came here to do my master's in industrial design engineering. And after I graduated, I worked as an industrial designer. So I went to Denmark, and I worked at Lego for a number of years, and then I moved back to London, and I worked as an industrial designer in different studios. And then after many years, then I had my children, and then when my daughter, my youngest, was 3 and started nursery, that's when I started a PhD, which I completed some months before the start of the pandemic. So I call myself a designer, researcher, and lecturer, because what I do now is a combination of all those different experiences.
So we invited you today because actually, as you said, you work with the object, but you also do a lot of research. And the first paper I read from you, which was from a long time ago, Intuitive Innovation, Parents Design Homework Environment. I thought it was really interesting because it talks about really working at home and your relationship with objects, but quite before the pandemic. If you could give me a brief introduction about this paper, and did you write this paper for your PhD or was it separate?
Yeah, so that was at the beginning of the PhD. At the beginning, I was looking at parents who worked from home, parents of young children who worked from home. A lot of my PhD was informed by my own experiences as designer and parent, but also by observations of other people who were in similar situations. So that paper was the early days of the PhD, and I interviewed some parents here in the UK, some based in Europe, and some in South America. And I asked them how they, the kind of solutions that they made so that they could work while they had to look after their young children. And I found that in some cases they made some very interesting arrangements, for example, creating a miniature office, like a miniature desk with cardboard right next to the desks, so the child could mimic and imitate that. And these were very temporary solutions because obviously there are distractions and interruptions, but these were some of the attempts. Another attempt was perhaps putting a child on your lap and then dividing the screen into two, so you would be working on something and maybe there was a little animation. But they were all very temporary solutions, but I was interested in to see how people managed in these situations where there's kind of blurred boundaries and you have to manage doing different things at the same time. And of course, depended very much on the particular situation. So in some cases, people had their own office that they already set up before having children at home. So the boundaries were quite clear that their children would have to be invited, for example, to that space. Whereas in other cases, it was much more improvised and constantly changing. So it depends on the space, that people have and so on. But it was like early pilot kind of research on the area that I was entering. Later on, it became much more specific. I focused much more on the relationship with smartphones for mothers who have the primary role of care of their young pre-nursery children.
I thought it was really interesting because it touches a lot of the topic that happened during the pandemic and how the parents had to deal also with the kids and the multitasking and the fact that they didn't have the space, so they had to take the kids while they were using their computer for work.
Yeah, a lot of those issues became very acute during the pandemic.
It was nice that you conclude the article by saying that a physical separation is the only solution.
Yes, it very much depends on the profession as well. So when I had a conversation with somebody who works in law, and for her, the separation was absolutely important. She didn't want to have anything to do with family life while she was working. But then in other cases, some people had much more relaxed boundaries. So it really depends on the arrangements that you have at home or with the path in your work that you do. So I think the issue about separation it depends on the age of the child as well, of course. The division, clear boundaries they're very difficult to manage, but are important.
I saw you also did a couple of other articles, which is called Family Ritual 2.0, if you want to give a brief introduction.
Sure. Yeah, so that was a collaborative project. So there were various universities involved, but the part I was more focused in was between the RCA, where I was based, and Newcastle University's Open Lab. So the project was very much an exploration of the value of rituals in families where somebody in the family might have to travel regularly because of work travel. So this was before the pandemic, so people were traveling much more. And so the work was a collaboration with a technologist, David Chatting, and there were also anthropologists. And what we did was we did a series of design-led explorations, so cultural probes, interviews with families that had this experience of separations and reunions that happened regularly. And then we tried to see what digital technologies could do to maybe maintain or interpret these rituals. And so for each of these families that we worked with, we designed a machine that we called a ritual machine. And this machine they lived with for a brief period of time, and each machine kind of interpreted that particular ritual. So for one family, it was having a drink together at the end of the workday. For another family, was planning a trip together and setting a time and having an anticipation for that trip. And so each of those machines responded to each of those rituals. And we designed them having in mind the environment that they designed at home. In one case, for example, this family, they had a home that was they were very design conscious. It was very minimalistic and monochromatic. So we designed a machine to fit into that style. Each of those machines responded as well from the point of view of the aesthetics, not only for the kind of the interactions, but also the way that it looked, so that it would fit the particular values of each of those families.
But that's really interesting, because also the idea of ritual is something that is coming up a lot with the pandemic, and the fact that you have to recreate your daily routine. Your ritual help you to handle more what's happening in the lockdown. I would like to just go directly to your new project. And my question is more like, how does this PhD and the research that you did before apply to fluid speculation and the project you're looking at it now? So what is the connection between the two?
The PhD, in which I explored the role of smartphones for mothers who had the primary role of care of young children, I was very interested in the relationship that this object has, the meanings that this object has for both mother and child. And the reason why I chose to focus on mothers was because I felt that there were certain kind of social expectations about how mothers should behave when it comes to these technologies in a space which is very emotionally charged. So that I find that there's a lot of judgment and expectation. So, for example, some of the mothers I interviewed said that they didn't like the fact that they had to use, or that they were using the smartphones while they were looking after their children, because they felt that it was kind of against their ideas of being good mothers, or maybe natural mothering or instinctive mothering. So the phone was felt as very intrusive, even though it's part of this network of objects, right? Like prams and toys and blankets and bottles. So the phone is there. It's an object. It's an interactive object, but it's also part of that network. And that same object, which has a role for the parent as a tool, perhaps a connection with work, it's also at times used by the child, right? It's a toy. So it's tool and toy, and has different meanings. And it's a very complicated relationship. And so the phone is felt at times as intrusive, but it's also felt sometimes as empowering. It's a distraction for both parent and child. And also there are certain expectations about technology. So even though it's felt that it's intrusive and maybe against ideals of good mothering or natural mothering in some cases, I found some parents talked about, for example, that enabling the child to use the phone would be educational, or preparing them for the future, or get them ready to learn coding, or things like that. So there's a certain amount of expectations about this object that is felt with love and hate. This is a very ambivalent relationship. And so I created a series of objects that I used as conversational objects. Those objects brought conversations with people. They were created to have certain conversations, maybe about private practices that people maybe found it difficult to talk about. So I had certain conversations with the participants I invited. But these objects emerged also from an exploration through drawing. As a designer, I've always done drawing. I've always done drawing with pencil and then a bit of watercolor to color inside with watercolor. So I did a range of drawings that I also translated into these objects that I used. But then when I finished the PhD, I started exploring much more directly with the watercolor and the brush, so without any pencil. So that meant that I wasn't able to erase anything. And this was sometime at the end of my PhD and the beginning of the pandemic. And so I started creating lots of drawings of objects with the watercolor and brush. And the fact that I wasn't able to erase things, and that the watercolor is a very fluid material that somehow moves around on paper and suggests forms. You don't have much control. And so that was very liberating, and also it enabled me to have a process of conversation about what objects could be, where I could merge them. Maybe if I drew two objects together, the boundaries between one object and another one would blur. So all these explorations began with a PhD, but then I guess because of the pandemic and we were at home a lot and I don't have a workshop, drawing with watercolor became a form of drawing, but also making, because there's a lot of material engagement there. Yeah, we were at home and we were, stuck here. So it was a way of working things out through drawing.
So the drawing have been made only by you, or you're involving other people?
Yes. So then I started inviting people to have what I called drawing conversations. So this was all done during the lockdown. So I invited different people at different times, and I would have a Zoom meeting. I would draw something and they would draw something, and then we would start merging our drawings. And what was very interesting was that in the merged drawings, we could see each of our own perspectives. So, for example, when I did a drawing with somebody maybe who works a lot with surveillance cameras, so it was the merged drawings had both our perspectives, and we could think of, if I drew a vacuum cleaner and the other person drew a surveillance camera, and we started merging those drawings, then the resulting drawings were strange combinations of perhaps vacuum cleaners or parts of vacuum cleaners with surveillance cameras. And then we could start thinking, okay, what would happen if there's the two things go together? And these conversations were the reflection of both our perspectives, but it was also a really nice way to get to know other people. So I started doing these drawing conversations with other people in the field of design research and HCI. And then I started inviting people in other fields. So I had one conversation with a quantum physicist and another one with a mathematician and with a sexual health clinician. So each of those drawings reflected our own kind of disciplines.
So the idea is that you were inviting people to draw one object that you propose, for example, the vacuum cleaner, and then...
No, I would draw something and I would say, you draw something that is related to your work or your research interest. And they would not tell me. First, they would draw it. So on the other side of where they were, we would just draw it and then we'd show each other on the screen. And then I would say, okay, this is what I have, this is what I created. And then we would try to create drawings that merge those two drawings. So if we say we would do 6 drawings in total, and the first drawing is my vacuum cleaner and the last drawing is, say, a surveillance camera. So the drawings in between would have to be evolution drawings that go from one to the other one. It's an exercise that is inspired by surrealist games, ideational exercises, artistic conversations. But the idea of doing it with people in other fields, and at the time of the pandemic, to try to connect with somebody else, but also to learn about their point of view through a drawing and see what would happen if we put our minds together in the design of an object. For example, even when I did the exercise with a quantum physicist, it was really interesting. First of all, to hear, he was telling me that they have these meetings where they write down the formulas and then they have conversations over coffee. I think they call them theorem coffee. And actually writing a formula is a form of drawing, right? It's an abstract representation. He was telling me that, they write something and then somebody say, no, let's delete this and let's put this instead. And that's very similar to how, architects or designers work when they're brainstorming together and they're having a drawing. Right? You're having a representation of something. It's not the real thing, it's a representation of that. But there's a freedom on the paper where you can try lots of things before you actually start making anything. And I'm really interested in that because it's abstract thought and you're trying to engage. But what I'm saying, I'm trying to show you what I'm thinking. And, the image I have in my head might be different from the image that you have in your head. But by trying to put it on paper somehow, maybe we can get somewhere in the middle and converge our ideas.
I think it's nice because then you really look at the process rather than the final object somehow. And
Yes.
And you're trying to find a method which could merge different point of view. So the idea is that you invited people and the people, they're all using watercolor.
No, the exercise emerged from watercolor. I told people to use whatever they felt comfortable with. But as it turned out, a lot of people did like using watercolor as well. They felt like experimenting with those materials. The people who had experimented more with watercolor were designers or people working more in HCI, those kind of researchers. Whereas when I invited the mathematician and the sexual health clinician and the physicist, they used a pen. But I do think that the watercolor kind of facilitated. It's so imprecise. It's very liberating in the fact that you have to abandon an attempt for precision. You let the material also guide what you're doing. Actually, that's really nice to think, okay, I'm sure that some mistakes are going to happen, and that's okay.
But I think it's also very interesting because it's exactly the opposite of what is the field of design and architecture of today.
Exactly. So as an industrial designer, when you're trained, precision in drawing, when you're making the CAD drawings is very important, especially if you're going to have these things made or somebody has to interpret those drawings, or if you're thinking of reducing waste or using a minimal amount of material. Those are important parts of the process. But in ideation, at the beginning, when you're trying to work things out, and you might want to kind of revisit an existing object. So a lot of my drawings are about existing objects. They're examples of, industrial design. And my drawings are very kind of childlike. They're not that precise. And I find that I look at them in a different light, right? It really challenges that rational precision and makes me think of how they could be different and how could they be merged with other things, or how they could suggest other things. So there's something lovely about this ambiguity, right? So something is drawn, something is left out, something is suggested, and you could leave it there. And that's actually really nice because they're just ideas and it's pure possibility, right? I quite like that. For example, when I did this drawing with the physicist, so I drew an espresso coffee pot and he drew Feynman's models of particle movements. And then the drawings that we created in between, one of them, which I found I could relate to more, was part of a coffee pot, but had 4 holes where the coffee could come out. So for me, that's a coffee pot that could serve for 4 teacups. But when he was looking at it, he was saying, yes, this is particle movement. And he was analyzing this drawing from his perspective, right? He was talking about particle movement. So the same drawing has different meanings to different people. And I think that similar things happen with objects as well. We all give meaning to things, even if they're unfinished or ambiguous. And those are reflections of our own perspectives or standpoints. And I find that really interesting.
How were you using your living spaces at home and how this has changed during your lockdown experience?
Before the pandemic, I was working a lot from home, and where my husband would be working more at his office, my children would be at school. But then during the pandemic, the house was full. We have also a dog. So it was the creation of divisions of spaces was really important. So sometimes I'd be working in the kitchen and my partner in the living room, and then my children doing school in their own computers. And this was changing all the time. And then the kitchen had to be used for lunch together. So the boundaries were constantly changing. Things got used up much more. It's like, so cabinet hinges in the kitchen, they were used up a lot. My children became teenagers in the pandemic. That has had a big impact as well. So they're eating more, they're cooking more. The house felt smaller, but at the same time, we had a few rituals, which was important to keep us some sanity. Like a lot of them were to do with food. So maybe one day a week we'd try to make pizza or watch a movie. We got a lot of plants in the house, so plants became very valuable. And then trying to escape from the computer as well, try to go for walks where we could go for a run as well. So they were at the very intense period of lockdown when I was teaching, I would see lots of students, lots of meetings in one day. And so going for a run was really important.
And what type of value do you give to objects and how this has changed during your lockdown experience?
Well, they all kind of vary, but the coffee maker is very important. I think it's a lovely ritual. It gives me a space if I'm working on something and I need a space. It's a nice ritual of taking a break, making the coffee, waiting for it to brew, the smell. They became quite important. I saw somebody wrote in your book about recipes, family recipes. So I have a few recipes written by my grandmothers and they're handwritten. And so they became really valuable, kind of family treasures, and tried to replicate the food. Yeah, so family memories, I think that they became important because traveling was, not possible. Yeah, and then all my painting and drawing tools became very important as well.
What does sociable objects means to you, and what does it make you think they were sociable objects?
I think all objects are sociable. All objects have a network of relationships with different people. So like I said, like when I talked about the phone, the phone has a different meaning for different people, different users. And so, yeah, they're all part of society. They're all part of the relationships with each other and with that object and through those objects. So yeah, I think all objects are sociable, really.